next speaker, Antonia Macaro. Antonia got in touch with me out of the blue back in 2010, when we were both a little less grey than we are now, and asked if I would talk to her about Stoicism for an article she was writing about the therapeutic benefits of Stoicism. Antonia comes from a psychotherapy background. I met with her, we chatted, she wrote an article for the Philosopher's Magazine about whether Stoicism might be useful for people today. On the back of that conversation, which was the first time I'd really thought about the practical therapeutic side of Stoicism, I then went off, did some research. I found Donald's book and read Donald's book before we'd met. Antonia really got me thinking about all of this stuff 2 years before we even dreamt up of Stoic Week. So she's a real trailblazer.
Thank you, John. Now, of course, you're all going to be completely disappointed by this presentation. I'm preparing myself as a good Stoic, or not. Anyway, so I'm going to say a few things about Buddhism and Stoicism. And what I'm going to say is based on... Can you hear me, by the way? Yeah. It's based on that book. And I just wanted to say a few words about what kind of project that was, so that you understand the background to my research. And so the subtitle of the book is Buddhist and Stoic Wisdom for a Skeptical Age. And the first Stoic that I was addressing was me, because I was very attracted to Buddhism most of my life, and to a lesser extent to Stoicism, but I always felt there were things I just couldn't accept. There were some principles or the metaphysics of it I couldn't really take on board. So after many years, I decided that I was going to see what happened if we get rid of the metaphysics in both of those systems and see what's left. And so what I have observed is that a lot of the time when people do that, they get rid of the metaphysics, what's left is something quite small, which is just little tips to be happy, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with having little tips to be happier, but it seemed to me that there was much more that these traditions could offer that we could draw on. And so I was trying to walk this tightrope between taking too much, which was the whole system, and taking too little, which for me was just taking little tips. So that was my first question: what can we take that is less than the whole system and more than just tips to be happier? The second question was just how similar the traditions are, because as John said, it's often pointed out that there are strong similarities, so I just wanted to see what they were. So that was these were my questions, and obviously it's a very personal approach, and someone else might have found different answers, but what I'm going to tell you now are the answers I found that worked for me. And just another couple of words about the historical background, because it's very intriguing to think that there might have been some direct philosophical transmission between India and Greece, but in reality we don't know very much at all about what actually was transmitted. But one way to think about it is that at that time, so in the 5th and 4th century BC, in that area, there was no East and West as we think of now. So Stephen Batchelor has put it in a way that I thought was interesting. He said that it was that whole area was a single interactive cultural sphere, and this area was this, and it was occupied first by the Persian Empire, and then by the Empire of Alexander the Great. And there must have been trade routes and diplomatic routes between Greece and India, and so there must have been cultural transmission. We just don't know really what that was. One thing we do know is that the skeptic philosopher Pyrrho traveled to India with Alexander in 334 BC, and he didn't write anything, but he's said to have met Indian philosophers and sages, and to have brought back a philosophy of agnosticism and suspension of judgment. And a lot has been made of this. There was a book called Greek Buddha last year that made a lot of this, that was claiming that he got these ideas directly from early Buddhism. But there does seem to be a lot of speculation, so we don't really know. So that is the answer. Anyway, the fact is that there are lots of similarities and differences, and I'm not going to say anything about the differences. Obviously, yeah, there are many, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the similarities that seemed most salient and important to me. The first one is the approach to the human condition. So in Buddhism, this is encapsulated in one word, which is dukkha, which is translated as suffering or unsatisfactoriness. More recently, it's translated more as unsatisfactoriness because they're not saying that life is constant suffering. They're just saying it doesn't deliver lasting satisfaction, which seems very true. And dukkha is said to be made up of these things: birth, aging, illness, death, getting what we don't want, not getting what we want, and losing what we want. And that seems to me a pretty comprehensive description, really, of the human condition. And the idea is that life equals dukkha, so it's the same things. We can't live without going through those things. We might, if we're very lucky, we might manage to miss out one or two of them, but ultimately we will get those things. So there's no way of living without having dukkha. And so it's completely deluded of us to think that we're going to find lasting happiness and satisfaction in the things of the world. And it's also mistaken to think that we can be made completely unhappy by these things. And these things are, in Buddhism, they're called the 8 worldly conditions. And they are gain and loss, fame and disrepute, praise and blame, and pleasure and pain. And so these are the things that we shouldn't get too attached to or distressed about. We should keep some detachment from. And I think it's quite interesting that there is an overlap with the Stoic indifference as things that we shouldn't consider good or bad. And so, for example, we have a list here that was left to us by Diogenes Laertius about what the Stoic indifference were, which is life, health, pleasure, beauty, strength, wealth, fair fame, and noble birth, and their opposites: death, disease, pain, ugliness, weakness, poverty, ignominy, low birth, and the like. And so it's a bit more detailed, but it seems to me that they are really looking at the same kind of thing, and they're both really singing from the same sheet and saying, don't get too attached to these things. So they saw them, both traditions saw themselves as providing some kind of treatment or therapy for these delusions that we have. And they often described the path as a treatment for a medical condition. So the disease would be human suffering in some way, for the Stoics also emotions. The cause is ignorance, primarily, of how things really are, what is truly valuable, and that leads to craving and attachment. The treatment is the path, for the Stoics in particular, philosophy. And the state of health is mainly clear understanding, which leads to non-attachment. Specifically, the Stoic diagnosis was that the disease is the faulty judgments that attribute good or bad to things other than virtue or vice, and these are the same as emotions. In Buddhism, we have another list. We have lots of lists in Buddhism, and this one is the 4 distortions of perception that are sensing no change in the changing, sensing pleasure in suffering, assuming self where there's no self, and sensing the unlovely as lovely. So in both cases, what we need to do is challenge these faulty judgments. So for the Stoics, it would be withdraw assent. For Buddhists, it's about developing the opposite of these things. So we need to appreciate impermanence, appreciate that life is dukkha, I'm not going to talk about no self, but appreciate that things don't have lasting essences. And appreciate that what looks lovely on the surface is not actually lovely at all. And that's, again, a message that I think the Stoics would be very familiar with and very in tune with. And I just want to make an aside here about the therapy, because obviously, so they saw themselves as providing this therapy for these delusions. But, and there are connections with modern psychotherapy. So as we've heard before, we know that Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck, so the founders of CBT and RABT, were influenced by Stoicism, in particular by this saying of Epictetus, that people are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of things. And the mindfulness movement has been inspired by an early Buddhist, in particular by an early Buddhist text called the Satipatthana Sutta. So there are links, but I just wanted to say that I think we need to be a bit careful and wary about making too much of these links, because what they would have meant by therapy and treatment is actually quite different from what we mean by therapy and treatment. So for them, both for Buddhists and Stoics, they were very radical philosophies. They were asking people to completely remodel their view of the world and the values they held. And so it wasn't really about feeling better, it was about seeing the truth and living according to the truth. So whereas modern psychotherapists don't tend to ask that much of the people who seek them. And so for me, the way I could think of putting it was that one would be about feeling and functioning better, so the modern version, whereas the ancient version was more about living truthfully. And of course there's a huge grey area in there, but I think there is a distinction to be made, and so we need to just be a little bit careful with using that word. Okay, so another similarity between the two traditions is that we should be wary of ordinary happiness. So the happiness that comes from things in the world going well and satisfaction of our desires and so on. And so there's a saying, there's a quotation by Seneca, which is, we often say that we are overjoyed that one person was elected consul, or that another was married, or that his wife has given birth. Events which, far from being causes for joy, are frequently the beginnings of future sorrow. It encapsulates things quite nicely. And on a similar note, is an early Buddhist text, the Sutta Nipata, says, what others speak of as happiness, this the noble ones speak of as misery. So they're not completely down on happiness. There is real joy and happiness to be had if you follow the path, and it's reliable and lasting, unlike ordinary happiness. But it's just not to be found where we normally look for it, which is in the satisfaction coming from things of the world. So real joy comes from, is a byproduct of other things. And looking at the literatures, what I came up with was that it was a byproduct mainly of three things. One is ethical conduct, the other is insight and understanding, and especially in Buddhism is a byproduct of meditative states. So interestingly, one version of the Buddhist path, which is the more common version of the Buddhist path, is the Eightfold Path. But there is another streamlined version of it that, funny enough, covers just those three things as the main elements of the path. So it's Sila, which is morality or ethical action, Samadhi, which is concentration or meditation, and Panya, which is insight or wisdom. So these are the three main elements of the path in this version of it. And according to some scholars, it is mainly Sila and Panya, so morality and insight, that are the real important elements, and the other is more like a way to achieve them. And wisdom and morality are very interdependent. So this is a quotation from the Buddhist text. So just like two hands washing each other, wisdom is purified by morality, and morality is purified by wisdom. Where one is, the other is. The moral man has wisdom, and the wise man has morality. And the combination of morality and wisdom is called the highest thing in the world. And so I think we can sort of see how that would work, and I think the Stoics would think very similar things, that if you start seeing things more clearly, it will become easier to act ethically, and if you start acting ethically and less selfishly, it will also be easier to see things more clearly. So the two things feed into each other. And the third element is mental discipline, and so the word used in the Buddhist text is samadhi, which it mainly refers to states of concentration. But it is also a more general word for meditation in general. And if we just think about the concentration aspect of it coming from particular forms of meditation, we might think that there's not much of an overlap with Stoicism, but in fact there is. So first of all, meditation is, so samadhi is also a more general word. There's also another word that is bhavana in the Buddhist text, which refers to mental exercises. quite similar to what the Stoics would have had, so reading, reciting the texts, and so on. So translating this in more ordinary language, I thought that these three elements could be called seeing clearly, living ethically, and daily practice. And I thought that these could be the foundation for a modern skeptical practice in a way, because I don't necessarily agree with Buddhists or Stoics about what cultivating each of these might mean. So I might mean something quite different from seeing clearly or living ethically or daily practice. But I do agree that there are important parts of the good life. There are three foundations of the good life. And that, I think, is also irrespective of any good mental states that come out of it. So you might feel happier as a result of cultivating these things, and according to the text, you should do. But they're important regardless of whether you do or you don't. And I like this quotation by Seneca again, which is, just as in a field that has been plowed for corn, some flowers grow up in between, yet all that work was not undertaken for this little plant, however much it pleases the eyes. So too, pleasure is not the reward or the motive of virtue, but an accessory. So any good mental states are nice if they come, but they're not what we're looking for. And that's, I think, the same in both of those traditions. And I'll just say a few things about each of them. So what might, so seeing clearly, first of all, what it meant for them. So for the Stoics, it meant primarily appreciating that virtue is the only genuine good, and indifferent things are treated as indifferent. And for Buddhists, it's mainly about, it's complicated. In Buddhism, there are complicated views about views, but certainly we can say that appreciating that life is dukkha, impermanent, and that things are devoid of essence is probably the main thing that we can understand as seeing clearly. And so for both of them, the wisdom was about mistrusting misleading appearances and valuing, giving things their proper value. But so what can it mean for us? Because, as I said, I don't necessarily take everything on board that has been traditionally part of this tradition of these systems. So what can we take away? And for me, there were a few things. So for example, reflecting on our values. I think it's really important. And so I don't necessarily agree with all the Stoic or Buddhist values, so I'm more of an Aristotelian, so I'd probably want to bring in more of our embodied nature and our emotional experience into our daily life. So I probably wouldn't be as extreme as some of the Stoics were, but I certainly think that it's important to reflect on it, and I would agree that because things are dukkha and impermanent and outside our control, we should choose our values carefully. So perhaps there are some values that we can just let go of, or if we realize we're too attached to certain things, or the more superficial things of the world, perhaps we can work on letting go of them a bit. Whereas there are other things, for me, like human relationships, for example, that I think are important, and but we do need to be aware that they are dukkha and impermanent, and be prepared for that. So that's one thing, but that's something that probably we all need to come to our own conclusions about that. And the other is seeking the truth, and that's primarily about having good mental habits like critical thinking and seeking evidence and valuing reason, having habits of curiosity and intellectual honesty, and so on. And also cultivating a healthy skepticism. So that Marcus Aurelius says quite a lot about that. So we are quite finite, limited creatures, and there's a lot that we'll probably never know about ourselves and the world. So that's also another thing, a good thing to bear in mind. The second element is living ethically, which for both tradition, both Buddhism and Stoicism, have a very high ethical ideal. So the sage and the people who are awakened have come to a situation in which their moral judgments are always correct and appropriate, and wholesome actions always flow effortlessly. So obviously there aren't that many people who have achieved that, but that is the ethical ideal. In Buddhism in particular, the Buddha is said to have overcome greed, aversion, and delusion, and acts only from non-attachment, kindness, and wisdom. So the question is, what can we take away? And so we're probably not, well, we might not get there, but if we look at in Buddhist texts, there's the notion of wholesome action, which is untainted by greed, aversion, and delusion. And again, we might not come to the situation where we're always acting from the opposite of those. But we can take some inspiration from that, and a lot of it is about the importance of intention, so examining our own intentions and trying to make sure that we act from kindness, non-attachment, and wisdom. And this is again something that the Stoics would have been very familiar with and would have really endorsed. So there's the usual, the famous analogy of the archer, so that what we can control is our intention, so aiming to be virtuous. Another way to think about it, there are lots of different perspectives about ethics that we can take. So I've chosen some of them. Another perspective is in terms of ideal qualities. So one of them is compassion, which we can really describe as concern for others' well-being and the motivation to help. And it's particularly important in Buddhism. So the Buddha agreed to teach out of compassion, being initially reluctant to teach. But it's a tricky quality in both traditions. So in Buddhism, it can lead to aversive, unwholesome mental states. So too much dwelling on suffering can lead us into aversive mental states, which is not a good thing. And in Stoicism, it can involve faulty judgments. So, for example, if we see a beggar in the street and we feel compassion, it's probably going to be because we think that they're in a bad situation. And this is a faulty judgment because poverty should not be seen as an indifferent, and so it should not be seen as a bad thing in itself. So it's a difficult quality. There is a right way to be compassionate for both of them. So for Stoicism, is just without buying into faulty judgments, what we need to understand is that what is bad is not the actual situation, but the suffering person's understanding of it. And in Buddhism, it's without attachment, like the Buddha did himself. So for both, compassion is important. It is important to have that fellow feeling, to have concerns for others' well-being, and be motivated to help, but you just need to be balanced, and the other quality it needs to be balanced with is equanimity. So equanimity is really important for both traditions as well. So we have apatheia in Stoicism, which is freedom from passion. In Buddhism, we have something called upekkha, which refers to looking upon the goings-on in the world with balanced awareness. And so again, they seem to come from a very similar place on this. I just want you to point out that equanimity is important and valuable because it reflects a truthful understanding of the world, not because it's a nice feeling. So it's again, what we're after is not primarily mental states, it's primarily a truthful understanding of the world. And equanimity also has its problems because it can slide into indifference, so it should be balanced with compassion. And so I ended up with this ideal of compassionate equanimity, which the main question, is it really possible? And I don't know. I mean, it's an open question. If you have any thoughts about that, I'd like to hear them. I think there's certainly a tension between withdrawal and engagement that is present in both traditions. I don't know what the answer is. I think it's possible that for most people, you'd end up falling one way or the other. So if you care, you probably also get attached to things and suffer when you lose them. If you become very equanimous, you might end up not caring. I don't know. I am open to the possibility that there will be some kind of higher state of consciousness in which you can have those things, but I think probably most people are likely to fall one way or the other. So it's something to be aware of. So what can we take from that? And I think if we take the ideal with a pinch of salt, we can be inspired by it, because I think things like kindness and even-mindedness are things that probably we could all do with more of. I certainly could, and I think most people probably could. So we could cultivate those. The third element of the good life was daily practice. which is absolutely necessary to overcome habitual patterns of thought and action, because even if we know how to think about the world, to actually feel like that is difficult. So we might know that certain things of the world are not that valuable, but we might be drawn to them anyway. We might still see unlovely things as lovely, and so on. So we need a lot of practice to overcome these patterns of thought and action. And that's why daily practice is so important in both traditions. I think we had a bit of this quotation before. I think it's a really good one. So Seneca again saying that just as some dyes are readily absorbed by the wool, others only have to repeat its soaking and simmering. So there are some studies that show up well in our minds as soon as we have learned them. This one, though, must permeate us thoroughly. It must soak in, giving not just a tinge of color, but a real deep dye, or it cannot deliver on any of its promises. And I think that's very true, and as usual, very well put. So this was achieved in Buddhism through formal meditation program of various kinds of meditations, and in Stoicism through various kinds of mental exercises that I'm sure people will be familiar with. And just want to say a few last words about how that works in practice, because so what we're trying to do through our daily practice is to become wiser and more insightful and more ethical in our lives. But in practice, how does that work? So the main mechanism is that we need to do that by becoming more aware of our first reactions to things. So it's reactions of good and bad, that usually we were not really aware of them. We just react to things all the time, thinking good, bad, move towards, move away from. And we're propelled into automatic reactions from this initial assessment. So in Buddhism, they're called Vedana, which is usually translated as feelings, but it doesn't have anything to do with emotions. It just means that. It means those initial impulses are good, bad, and neutral. And in Stoicism, you have impressions. And so the idea is that by becoming more aware of these, you create a bit of distance between that impulse, that appraisal and impulse and action, and so you're able to have a more reasoned and balanced response. And so I'm finally going to mention the word mindfulness, which is really an important one. I'm using it in a general sense. It's a way of paying attention. In some of the modern versions, it's often it's defined as being paying attention in the present moment, and that's not always the case in Buddhist texts. But it is a way of paying attention. It's just used differently in different practices, and so this is a really important skill in both traditions. And in the Buddhist texts, mindfulness is described in various ways. One of them is as a cowherd, keeping an eye on his cows or her cows from the distance. Another one is about a gatekeeper allowing only entry to the good and keeping out the bad, which again is quite in tune with things that the Stoics have said. So, for example, Epictetus said that a philosopher keeps watch over himself as over an enemy in ambush. So that's what we have to do. We have to basically it's a constant self-monitoring, trying to catch these initial reactions and challenging them and reminding ourselves of the right way to look at things and the right way to act. And so what we can take away is that it's just that is an important skill, and that skill is the foundation of ethical behavior. And so it seems like a small thing to learn, but it's actually quite a big thing with a big impact, or potentially a big impact on our life. And I could certainly do with more of that, and I think most people could too. And that's what I'm going to leave you with. Thank you.